Romulus founded Rome, Augustus founded the Roman Empire, and Romulus Augustulus saw the fall of Western Rome. Constantine founded Constantinople and the Eastern Empire, and another Constantine was its emperor when both fell. This kind of poetic nature is frequent in Roman history. Just look at how in the Empire of Trebizond, which fell 8 years after the Queen of Cities, the last 2 emperors were called Alexios and David. Like the founders of the Trapezuntine Empire, Alexios and David Megas Komnenos. We will cover not only their short reigns and the fall of Trebizond, but also the consequences and aftermath. Ioannis IV died after relegating his realm to his son-in-law, Uzun Hasan of Aq Qoyunlu, and his daughter, Theodora Megale Komnene, now known as Despina Khatun. Like her namesake, she was something of a Theodora to Uzun Hasan's Justinian, if that analogy makes sense. While he transformed the Aq Qoyunlu from just a Mesopotamian Turkic tribal confederation into a new, truly grand Perso-Islamic empire by his conquests, reforms, and copious amount of legislation to make Tribonian proud, she was ever by his side, acted as the protectress of Christians in this vast imperium, and masterminded much of the anti-Ottoman alliance both Trebizond and Aq Qoyunlu had been building. Eastern Anatolian Christians, from Romans to Armenians and Georgians, flocked to support the Padishah, while the Latin West, ever more conscious of the Ottoman menace after the fall of Constantinople, would also gradually befriend him. And the actions of Mehmed II, when observing his opposition, speaks volumes to how effective it was. The Sultan feared the Aq Qoyunlu-Trebizond union so much that he began preparing for the final invasion of the Pontian Roman Empire immediately after the marriage of the Turkic Justinian and Theodora. In 1459, he already took Amisos to launch his navy, and the Ottomans and Aq Qoyunlu clashed frequently around Trebizond. Sources of this period: Roman, Venetian, heck, even Mehmed's greatest sycophant, Georgios Amiroutzes the Turcophile, who might have tipped his country right into the hands of the Porte, could find no casus belli for the Sultan's aggression against Trebizond, who paid their tribute to him on time. An empire that burned with the last embers of Roman imperial tradition had to go, or Mehmed would never feel secure. In the empire itself, Emperor Alexios V Megas Komnenos succeeded his uncle Ioannis IV. He was the son of Ioannis' late brother and co-emperor Skantarios, and he was just 4 years old. Guess what happens to young Komnenian boy emperors who take the throne after the sudden death of their predecessor? They get usurped by their charming uncle, of course, as history has shown. Ioannis' other brother, David Megas Komnenos, was unamused. He was the despotes of Ioannis, who trusted him to lead military expeditions against the Genoese and conduct diplomacy with the Turks. Why should the kid rule? In 1460, David got the support of the Kabazitai, the most influential archontic family of Trebizond of the time, and deposed his nephew. Now he was the last emperor of Trebizond, and he knew the vulnerability of his realm, so he redoubled the anti-Ottoman diplomatic efforts started by his brother. David went on an IR spree, allying with the last Jandares in Sinope and trying to form a holy league with the Pope. Cardinal Bessarion of Trebizond had actively tried to stir a crusade in Europe ever since 1453, but now with his own homeland in danger too, he was even more zealous in appealing to the Latin lords. One of David's more interesting new alliances is that with Florence, the rising new Italian city-state and heart of the Renaissance. One of Dante Alighieri's offspring was a merchant in Trebizond and acted as the emperor's envoy to his native Florence, which now received trade privileges in Trebizond like Venice and Genoa, its traditional partners. Now, just a word of caution, David, being the last Roman emperor, had acquired something of a mythical aura despite not being nearly as heroic as his brother-in-law, Constantinos XI in Constantinople. So not all sources about him were 100% authentic, and neither are all accounts of the imminent fall of Trebizond, mostly touched on by post-Byzantine historians Laonikos Hatkopondilis and Michael Kritopoulos of Imbros. After a while of secret preparations against Trebizond, Mehmed struck, but first Aunt David's joined his allies in Sinope, the finest port of the Black Sea. The Jandarids tried to be independent from the Ottomans for some time, and this was their final fall. In June 1461, Sinope was surrendered to Mehmed in exchange for the emir's retirement in the Ottoman Balkans. Trebizond, long ago founded by colonists from Sinope, was to share the fate of her mother city. The Sultan then proceeded into Aq Qoyunlu territory, advancing to Erzincan to cut off Uzun Hasan from rescuing Trebizond. The Ottomans ravaged Uzun Hasan's lands, so he sent his mother, Sara Khatun, to negotiate. Both Mehmed and his main commander, Mahmud Pasha, had great respect for Sara, and the Ottomans agreed to not trespass Aq Qoyunlu domains anymore if Hassan backed off from Trebizond. Sara asked Mehmed why he wanted it so badly. The Sultan's justification was the sword of Islam. Then Mehmed and Mahmud each led some men to enter the empire through very unconventional routes, as the direct southern route through Mesochaldia was blocked by the Kabazitai. The Ottoman fleet came first from Sinope and besieged Trebizond. The Roman defenders fought off the landing party and another cavalry unit sent ahead by Mehmed, but once the Sultan arrived with his big guns, those cannons that broke even the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, the Trapezuntines knew it was over. They could have gone on resisting and fighting to the last man like Konstantinos Palaiologos did 8 years earlier, but they didn't. They knew they wouldn't want to suffer like Constantinople. Importantly in Trebizond, the second most powerful man, the protovestiarios Amiroutzes, was very pro-Ottoman and did everything he could to convince David to surrender peacefully. Mahmud Pasha was the son of a Serb and a Trapezuntine, and he was cousins with Amiroutzes, so they began discussing terms secretly already. It was a fairly standard Islamic treaty: capitulation without a fight, for no sacking and enslavement. David and the Trapezuntines decided to accept and deal with the Sultan directly, so that once Mehmed came, the surrender terms were negotiated after some unpleasantries. Trebizond was handed over to the Turks on August 15, 1461. This was the end of the Trapezuntine Empire and the Komnenian dynasty at last. Trebizond was left to Kazim Bey to govern, and its population generally was dealt with in 3 ways. They were allowed to stay home and pay the jizya, or they were deported to Constantinople to boost the demographics of the new Ottoman capital, or they were unfortunate enough to be a pretty girl or well-built boy, in which case they were forced to join the Sultan's harem or Janissary Corps. As for its nobles, the Turkish administration attempted to slowly uproot them from their homeland. Emphasis on slow, as the archontic families of Kabazitis, Doranitis, Samson, etc. were strongly entrenched in Pontos, as was the Roman Orthodox tradition of its natives. This was why the southern regions of Trebizond resisted on after the fall of the capital, under the military leadership of local lords and maybe monks too. And then, even after the fall of all these provincial centers, they stayed relatively independent and preserved their old customs in the Ottoman Empire. The rest of the video is dedicated to explaining this phenomenon and narrating the fates of the Megale Komnene and their Trapezuntine civil and ecclesiastical elites. Only in Pontos proper though. We'll cover the other side of the Black Sea, the Principality of Theodora, next time. David and his family made obeisance to Mehmed and ensured the security of their property, plus a new holding for them in the Strymon Valley as compensation for losing their empire. Like despot Dimitrios Palaiologos, whose despotate of the Morea fell 1 year earlier, the last Megale Komnene were yanked from their land and integrated within the Ottoman imperial court and administration. After Mehmed had satisfied himself with his new territory, he transferred David and his retinue, including Amiroutzes and a few Kabazitai, to Constantinople, then their new home. David and his family lived in their Macedonian estate, being neighbors with Mara Brankovic, the adored Serbian stepmother of Mehmed and their own relative too, through the marriage of a sister of David with Mara's father, George. This Trapezuntine Serb connection made the Komnene and Mara all into one big family, like Amiroutzes and Mahmud Pasha. This made it easy for the imperial family of Trebizond to navigate the Ottoman court, and they got along fine for the most part. Especially Amiroutzes was having the time of his life, now that he had secured a position as the chief philosophical advisor of the Sultan. He was responsible for the fall of Trebizond, but he didn't care what his countrymen thought about him, shamelessly writing to Bessarion about the fate of their homeland and asking him for money to ransom his son, who was in danger of converting to Islam. It's possible that Bessarion sent the money. The boy was his godson, but both treacherous sons of Amiroutzes, Vasilios and Alexander, would Turkify later in life, becoming Mehmed Bey and Iskander Bey, confidants of Mehmed. But the greatest betrayal of Amiroutzes was causing the brutal downfall of the Megale Komnene in 1463, when rising pressure from Uzun Hasan made Mehmed even more paranoid of them than ever, and actively looked to solve his Komnenos problem. Besides the existing alliance between David and Uzun Hasan, his family was literally a living symbol, not just of Roman imperial tradition, but also Komnenian legitimacy. The prestige associated with them was enormous among the Sultan's Roman and Christian subjects. See, even Mehmed himself lied that he was descended from Alexios I Komnenos. And what do you know? Some suspiciously incriminating letters were soon found by Amiroutzes in David's possession from his niece, Despina Khatun, asking her uncle to send to her one of his sons, or even the young ex-emperor Alexios V, to the court of Uzun Hasan. Mehmed dragged David, his sons, and nephew Alexios to the execution block for this supposed conspiracy, and murdered them after they refused to apostatize. Their execution is traditionally dated to November 1st, which is now their feast day, since the last Komnene had been recently canonized as saints, which is why I'm posting this video on November 1st, 2025, but anyway. The slaughter of the Komnenos men sent shockwaves to as far as Western Europe, while back east, the Komnene women had to cope with what Mehmed planned for them. David's daughter Anna was sent to his harem and married off to Zaganos Pasha, who mistreated her, and she probably died because of it. More dramatic, but mysterious, was the fate of David's wife, who managed to replay a macabre medieval version of Sophocles' Antigone. Mehmed left the remains of the Komnene exposed and forbade anyone from giving them a proper burial. The last empress of Trebizond dug their graves with her own hands and was fined by the Sultan. Her friends paid the fine, but she died inside already and lived the rest of her days next to her dead family, if you believe this late anecdote. Now, back to Amiroutzes, because this duplicitous polymath just kept rising, to the point of dictating the affairs of the church. I'd say in a way, he was like the Gennadius Scholarius of the Trapezuntines, for he secured the relative well-being and many religious privileges for his fallen people by cooperating with Mehmed, though he lacked even the basic honor of Scholarius, who died 1 year before. His successor, the second Ottoman Patriarch of Constantinople, was Alexios I, an upright priest who upheld canon law. But Amiroutzes was the opposite, and when he saw the beautiful widow of the last Duke of Athens, he lusted hard, very hard. So hard that he intended to marry the widow without divorcing his wife. Unlike his sons, he never apostatized, despite acting like a convert already, so he needed the patriarch's consent to do his bigamy. Alexios obviously refused, so Amiroutzes cried to Mahmud and Mehmed. The result was that a layman's complaint caused the patriarch to be humiliated by shaving his beard, and the future patriarch, a churchman named Manuel, mutilated by having his nose slit. Such horrible acts made Alexios downright suicidal, and the Ottoman Patriarchate's leadership was up for grabs. Amiroutzes became the community leader of the Trapezuntines Mehmed deported to Constantinople, and they became one of the factions in this patriarchal rivalry. Meanwhile, in 1465, Mehmed confirmed Dubera, the birthplace of Amiroutzes, a Pontian village just south of Sumela Monastery and one of its monastic estates, which Alexios V Megas Komnenos granted tax immunity back in the day to keep enjoying its status and revenue. More on this little village of big importance later, but now we should know that Amiroutzes used his home income to back his patriarchal candidate, Simeon of Trebizond, in 1466. He bribed Mehmed with it and became Patriarch Simeon I of Constantinople with his simony, before Mara Brankovic, whose monastic estates in Macedonia were the rival of Sumelas in Pontos, outbid Simeon and made Mehmed elevate her man, Dionysius, who reigned as Patriarch until 1471 when Amiroutzes and Simeon's faction accused Dionysius of having circumcised and deposed him. Simeon bribed Mehmed again and promised to put down the ongoing Aq Qoyunlu attempt to restore the Megale Komnene to Trebizond to begin his second term as Patriarch. He appointed the Metropolitan of Trebizond, Pancratius, to smooth the Trapezuntines who were helping Uzun Hasan in 1472. Trebizond had a Metropolitan again, but Simeon was deposed again in 1475 by another candidate of Mara, and around that time, his patron Amiroutzes died ingloriously in the game of dice. The last protovestiarios of Trebizond got the end he deserved, and the sheer irony that the next patriarch would be the noseless Manuel who once stood against his immorality is just too good. The patriarch Maximus III reigned from 1476 to 1482, bringing at last a short period of peace to the Ottoman Roman Church, until Simeon weaseled back for his third term after Maximus' death. Genuinely, Simeon was to blame for the beginning of the corruption of the Ottoman Patriarchate, although he contributed something to his people by holding the 1484 Synod of Constantinople, which rejected the union signed in Florence, officially restoring Orthodoxy as it was before, within the Ottoman Rome millet. He died intestate shortly after the Wallachians candidate removed him in 1486, haunting the Patriarchate even in death with his massive inheritance. But that's a whole other story. I used the tale of the Constantinopolitan Trapezuntines as an excuse to present to you the earliest days of the Rumilet and their ethnarchs, the patriarchs. So, see this as an elaboration on my epilogue to both the Constantinople and the Trebizond series. I'm sure you prefer to be spared from the Roman politics in the city, so now let's see what happened to the Trapezuntines who kept defending their homes. Like with the fall of Constantinople, various Roman localities in the Morea resisted many years. In Trapezund, the capital fell, but some cities in Mesochaldia held out. We really lack solid historical accounts for these events, but I'll do my best to present them, as preserved in the popular ballads of Pontos. The cities defied the Ottomans up to a few months, not long. Gerasus resisted until they surrendered on favorable terms for the Christians of the city, and Kordili, a city with a monastery fortress of Symphokas, was defended by a girl until it fell. Yes, a girl, a lass who killed 3,000 Janissaries when they assaulted the city, if you believe the songs. The castles lasted longer, most fell by betrayal instead, like Paliokastor, and the songs even record the name of the traitor, Marthas. In the southern marchlands of Mesochaldia, the territory of the Kabazitai, resistance ran up to 2 decades. They already scared Mehmed and Mahmud enough to go around them when attacking Trebizond, and though the Sultan immediately sent Kizilbeg to subdue Mesochaldia after he took the capital, and the main line of the Kabazitai were exiled along the Megale Komnenoi, some minor branch, or other Chaldean archons, continued to hold the main Kabazitai stronghold, Torul Castle, and the principalities around it. They were vassals of Uzun Hasan, and the Ottomans didn't really dare to occupy them as long as the Padishah of the Aq Qoyunlu threatened them in the rear. Although Uzun Hasan and Despina Khatun failed to prevent the empire from falling, they tried a few times to restore it. As early as 1463, when Uzun Hasan briefly took Trebizond, and the letters to David from Theodora might be genuine. But it took until the 1470s for her to emerge as a legendary figure in the West. The Venetians lost Negroponte to the Ottomans in 1470 and declared war. We saw in the Morea video they fought with the help of the Peloponnesian Greeks in the West. In the East, they turned to Uzun Hasan as a potential ally. Despina Khatun handled the correspondence and really impressed the Venetian ambassador, Caterino Zino, who wrote a lot about her. Uzun Hasan spent the few years since the fall of Trebizond enlarging his empire, becoming the master of Persia and Eastern Anatolia, so that he was already in open hostilities with the Ottomans since 1471. He advanced as far as Philomelion and menaced Mehmed badly. In 1472, Caterino secured his alliance. Venice would bring the Turkoman firearms. But Venice being Venice, they failed to deliver, and this proved disastrous. For now, Caterino returned home with his diplomatic victory and reports of the Aq Qoyunlu's triumphs in Pontos. Uzun Hasan demanded Mehmed for Trebizond and sent a campaign to revive it. Theodora led his troops through Samskit towards Trebizond, and the Trapezuntines were excited to throw off the Turkish yoke. It was for this that Patriarch Simeon sent Pancratius to calm everyone down. Eventually, the siege failed, but on the bright side, if the emperor could not be restored, the metropolitan was. Hasan pressed on, beat the Ottomans at Erzincan in 1473, then faced Mehmed at the Battle of Atlukbeli, where the Aq Qoyunlu had the upper hand initially, and Despina Khatun was there to encourage her husband to pursue the fleeing Ottomans. But, as history would have it, Atlukbeli was the catastrophic defeat that ended the rise of the Aq Qoyunlu. Partly because they didn't have those promised Venetian guns, and light cavalry didn't stand long against the Ottoman artillery. Thus ended the perspectives of restoring Trebizond, even if Theodora continued to see her eldest son as the rightful emperor and educated her daughters in their native Pontic Romaic language. But Uzun Hasan still spread fear among the Ottomans, and it was only after his death in 1478 that Mehmed would order his son, Bayezid, to finally take Torul. Now, no independent Roman localities remained in Anatolia after 1480. It's true that Pontos stayed majority Roman and had regions like Majuka which stayed fully Roman until the 20th century, but they were Ottoman subjects. However, I'd just like to add a word about the interesting story of early Ottoman Trebizond. Remember Dubera, the home of Amiroutzes that had its privileges confirmed? Well, There hailed a girl there called Maria. She was a concubine of Bayezid when he was being trained in Amasya, like Mehmed before him. They had a son, Selim, and when Mehmed died in 1481, Bayezid II became Sultan. He sent Selim and Maria of Dubera back to Pontos for the prince's training. Selim governed Trebizond from 1489 onwards with his mother, now Gulbahar Hatun, who was adored by her son and influenced him greatly. The two held court in Trebizond and raised the son born to Selim in 1494, Suleiman, together. So you know, before Selim became the greatest conqueror sultan of the Ottomans, his formative years were fully spent in Trebizond with his Trapezuntine mother. He was a benefactor of Sumela and Dubera, and before he got his title, Caliph and custodian of the two holy mosques, he was styling himself the Emperor of Pontos in his Greek letters to the Venetians. Before he led his famous conquests of Mecca and the Mediterranean, his first campaigns were to defend Trebizond from the expanding Safavid Empire of Shah Ismail, grandson of Theodora Megale Komnene. Ismail was a pain in Selim's ass even after he usurped from Bayezid in 1513. In 1514, he first built the finest mosque in Trebizond today, Gulbahar Hatun Mosque, in honor of his late mother, before defeating Ismail at the Battle of Calderon. The Persian prodigy faltered before Ottoman cannons, like Grandpa Uzun Hasan, great-great-uncle David Komnenos, and Constantinos XI before him. Thereafter, the Ottoman Safavid border was mostly stable for the Sunni Sultan Selim and Shia Shah Ismail, two Muslim emperors who traced lineages back to the Christian Roman Trapezuntine Empire. So this is how I end my narrative of Trapezuntine and Byzantine history proper, which began with the end of the Roman-Persian Wars and the rise of Islam. Now we are firmly done with the Middle Ages and into modernity, and here, two new empires became the Muslim geopolitical successors of those giants from antiquity. Emphasis on geopolitical. You know I don't support the Ottoman Roman LARP. Interestingly, it is after Selim and his son Suleiman that this LARP really began to fade, due to their conquests from Mamluks and Safavids, shifting to a more Islamic legitimacy. So for that, let's thank them, and the land these two great sultans were bred in. Trebizond, previously the home of the last Komnene, the last Roman emperors, and their empire, the last bastion of Imperial Rome. Thank you for following this journey, and a great thank you to my patrons for supporting me on making this series. Dragon Lord, Rofea Game Projects, Cody Danroth, Tiropita Productions, Francis Morin, Patrick Gampo, Kiasik, and Alexandros Sideris. Thank you all, everyone.